because the feds require certain minimum participation, while you wanted to empower parents to be able to opt out, the risk is if so many people opted out that you might actually lose significant federal funding. So that might be something of interest to some of the folks here, where we saw significant parental involvement over the last year trying to actually walk back some of what a lot of people felt was over-testing, because we kept seeing and hearing about a third of the time in the classroom was going to testing or teaching to the test or preparing to the test instead of classroom instruction. So we obviously balanced the budget this last year. We did see an increase in funding for K-12 education. We also saw funding for the senior homestead exemption this year come through. It's one of those things that gets funded in years where the funding is available, and when it's not, the homestead exemption doesn't get funded. And so for people on a fixed income or seniors in their home, that homestead exemption can be a real big pocketbook issue. We saw a whole package of student loan, college affordability, debt refinancing measures. All of them were killed in the Senate. A lot of that may be federal in focus, but the reality is there are some things we could do in the state. And last year we capped tuition increases for state facilities, just to try and slow the trajectory of the increased growth of the cost of student tuition and on the loans. And the other thing, well, so a couple other things. There was an attempt to get a study done for retirement security. I think a lot of people felt like their own personal, it's difficult to save for retirement, people are working harder, there's less money able to go into savings, but we tend to think of it in terms of a personal financial issue only, and the reality is across the board that very, very few people are in a position of actual retirement security. So it's not just the question of, you know, the state pension with PARA or Social Security, but there's a real drop in the number of private employers that are facilitating 401k savings and investments. And that was a study that was meant to get a fairly comprehensive, holistic view of the state of retirement health, or lack thereof, in the state. And unfortunately, that study was killed. But there are a combination of things that private people, private businesses, as well as with public partners can do to help improve retirement security, and hopefully we'll get to look at that next year a little bit too. And then outside of that, I would just say there was a large package of workforce development bills again this session. We have certain sectors. So obviously, while Colorado's unemployment has been improving compared to the rest of the country, it's still very uneven. We did have some rural economic development assistance grant bills that were defeated that could have done regional targeted investment for economic development. I think that would have been good for the I-70 corridor. And unfortunately, those were defeated. But there were some bills, I think it was about 7 in total, that combined were different aspects of workforce development. And some of the sectors that are higher paying are the aerospace, the biosciences, some of the healthcare sectors. And so most of those went through the process and were done in a bipartisan fashion and have been signed into law. So I think maybe that's just a good starting overview. We have a couple other legislators with us that also serve on some other committees that, if you have questions, are also available to help. But let me just turn it over to you guys and see if you have any questions for us or any suggestions on what you'd like us working on. Not to put you on the spot.
Well, yeah. One of the things, I'm from Peak Vista. We have a health center in Strasburg, and one of the things that was a major concern for us is around our workforce development, around attracting high-level quality staff, and everything from front desk and reception and dental assistants to physicians. And so that work is really important to us. It means so much for our community. What is it that we could work on together or think about in this next legislative session around bringing, about developing that workforce in our state, of course, but I-70 more specifically?
It's a good question. There have been some, in the healthcare arena in particular, there have been some attempts to come at partial loan forgiveness as an incentive. I guess a question I would have for you in your experience, if you were to hire locally from Strasburg and the corridor, do you have positions unfilled, and are you finding that there's a gap as far as training for people locally who are able to fill it? Or is it that people aren't locating here, that they're qualified, but that they're getting hired up by the metro area? If you can help us understand a little bit more of what's happening.
The answer is yes. All of those things are happening. We have a very specific goal of hiring very local economy is really important to us. And we are able to fill quite a few positions that way. There is the skilled and unskilled positions that are very difficult to hire. And you know, we have a workforce dilemma with our primary care providers nationally. This is not a I-70 issue specifically, but it certainly is an I-70 issue for us. And so we do have to go out and look outside of the community to find those individuals. And then when they are attracted to Colorado, Denver, of course, has a totally different market. And I realize that we're really close, but there's still a difference in that market, and more attractive for those physicians to go to.
Is there...
loan forgiveness is great, too.
Okay, because I do think there have been some baby steps we've done through the loan forgiveness angle.
Yeah.
And also the things that the state controls, like licensing fees. There's some small things we can do to offer incentives for people to think harder about locating professionally in areas.
Yeah.
And so there's taking the people who are getting trained and out of school and giving them a reason to really think long and hard about serving in some of these great smaller communities that they might not have thought about. And then on the flip side of that, it's taking a good look at the education pipeline in Strasburg or Bennett or Byers and seeing if through trade, vocational, community college schools that we're offering the kind of classes that would get people prepared to be hired locally. There have been some initial efforts there, but I think both Mary and I would, I do think that there's an interest in doing some follow-up there, and we might want to, sit down with you and talk a little bit more about the business model and get a sense of like what are your positions. Like if we were to do a snapshot today of what positions are you hiring for that haven't been filled, and see some state-based ways we can up the training and then increase the incentive a little bit about where people choose to locate.
I love also that later.
That's a big issue, and it affects a lot of the state beyond, it affects pretty much every rural and smaller community in the state too. Yeah, Sue?
Well, if I could just add a couple things. I'm Sue Ryden, State Rep House District 36, which comes a little bit past Hayes Mount Road, I think. It's a little bit curvy on the east side. But we passed a couple bills this year. One was the telehealth bill, which I think is going to be really beneficial for folks in rural areas. And when they explained to us how the process works, it was really pretty amazing. Have you had any experience with the telehealth piece?
Trying. Yeah, it's
because it costs a lot of money to initially get set up. But then once you do, then it's amazing that when they showed us the demonstration of how the doctor on the other end could sometimes actually see the patient better than in person. It was really an eye-opening experience to get that.
Because the quality of the video, the picture. Yeah. Agree.
And so that's one thing I think that's helping the shortage a little bit. And I know too, and I'm sure you're working with CU Medical School, and I know that they're really trying to incentivize the students. They're trying to get students from rural areas to begin with, because they found that the students who come from rural areas are more likely to want to go back to the rural area if they can.
Right.
And so I think they're making a big effort to try to do that, as well as having internships all around the state and getting these young students familiar. And some of them just fall in love, you know, with the countryside and decide that that's where they want to go. So those are just a couple of the things that I was familiar with. I serve on the Health Insurance and Environment Committee as well. So, but we really would love to hear your suggestions on, you know, specifics on how you think we can make the process better, because you're the ones that are on the ground trying to make it work.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
It's my understanding that it's the next 5 years, the billing around telehealth is going to change.
Yeah.
You know, that's a
Oh,
big
yeah,
deal
that
for
was-
us.
Yeah.
You know, all the technology is great, you know, but it costs.
That was part of
Yeah.
that bill too.
Good.
And I didn't bring a copy with me, but you can look it up online.
Okay.
And we've got a copy of the status sheet here, so this is a quick grid of all the bills that were offered here, and if I find it before we leave, I'll show it to you, but billing was a big issue.
I believe it was Joanne Janal's bill, so you can also go online and just click on her name, and it'll show you all the bills that she did for the
Who was
session.
that, sir?
Joanne Janal,
Okay.
Ginal.
Looks like House Bill 1029, healthcare delivery via telemedicine statewide, House Bill 1029.
Right. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
You go first, Mayor, please. I was just gonna say, I think some ancillary issues are to attract people to live in this area as well as work there are the commercial development that's going on and housing opportunities. Not all of those are things I think the legislature should help with, because I think the commercial development is pretty healthy compared to other communities, and more amenities are being offered, while at the same time, as you can see, you drove out here, remaining pretty rural. But housing opportunities aren't very diverse out here. Good news is we have affordable housing. We are loaded with affordable housing. We have very little in the way of condos or patio homes or apartments. So from a legislative standpoint, I think the one thing that might help, and I know it got out of the Senate this year, but not the House, is some sort of owner-occupied attached housing amendment that would still protect the homeowners, but would also incentivize builders a little more to build that product, because right now, I don't think that's the total answer to it, but I do think that incentive would help us a lot. Another bill that got out, that was passed, I think, because I just got a call on it, was House Bill 1033, which is a study on the impact of aging.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
part of that is going to be housing. We're going to be seeing this in rural communities as well. And so I think anything that encourages that diversity in housing, we'll do what we can in terms of working with builders and developers, but anything from a legislative standpoint that encourages that will not only help that situation, the baby boomers aging, but also attracting employees who will live in the same area.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the things that has for several years been an option about this, I think there's a lot of different ways we could come at trying to do targeted incentives of the right kind of housing stock in a very targeted way that isn't premised on weakening quality in construction or weakening homeowners' rates. And so one of the things that I think we need to take another look at is the state has a lot of incentives, and a lot of them aren't very well targeted. So what winds up happening is the really big companies are getting incentives in places where they don't necessarily need it for the types of construction we don't necessarily need in the places where we don't necessarily need it. And it adds up to a lot of money. And so given that we're a balanced budget state, one of the questions we should ask is if X amount of dollars is available, and did that comprehensive incentive study, it didn't make it through the process, because there was a separate bill That is like, let's do a really honest assessment. We have a lot of incentives and subsidies of taxpayer dollar that go to a lot of different programs. And we don't have good accountability on the back end to really see what bang for buck we're getting on that. And so one of the thinking is, and it's connected to your housing point here, that look, with the limited means that we have available, are we really being smartest with how we're doing these targeted incentives? Because you could do, you know, we have these TIFs and urban renewal authorities and enterprise zones, and we wanted to have an expanded rural enterprise area. But when the incentives serve to essentially make it more attractive for people to continue to build the wrong kind of housing stock in the parts of the state that don't need it, we may, our current laws may be in fact incentivizing the opposite of what you're talking about. So I think a couple things we could do is reassess where we're targeting now, and absolutely do a much more surgical job of where do we need the targeted incentives. There's so many different ways we could define it, which is, I mean, you could look at the housing stocks that are there, you could look at the unemployment rate, you could look at where there's new permits happening. We could partner with like the municipal league or with CCI, and this is all knowable.
Average household income would be helpful as well, because some of those lower average household incomes, as I say, we have a lot of affordable housing, but we don't have the condos and the apartments that tend to be a little less expensive as well.
Yeah, so I mean, and you're in a place where, at least as you said, there's some affordable housing, but not necessarily a good mix of housing stock. So those are two ideas that both have been in progress, and I think are worth revitalizing and trying to go again, because I suspect that there's enough slop, if you will, in poor definitions and accountability on some current incentives that we could probably do a much smarter job of targeting it to where it's really needed in our communities. And you'd be a good person to partner with us on that, because it tends to be very metro focused, and the people who are getting the incentives want to keep getting the incentives even though they may not necessarily be the ones that need it.
I just wanted to add to your question. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rhonda Fields, State Representative for House District 42, and wanted to respond to your questions about the skills gap, because about 2 years ago I sponsored legislation to look at that issue, and there's a standing committee that looks at how we can close the skills gap. And so what happened is the Department of Education has close to $1 million where grants are available for organizations, nonprofits, and schools to apply for grants to help close those achievement gaps. So for example, in Colorado, the Community College of Aurora applied for the grant. And it's a grant that helps, I would say, non-traditional students, like students who are in transition adults, where they're trying to advance their skills. And this program allows them to be CNAs. And it is a 8-week program where they go through the community college for that program, that certificate, and then they have access for jobs at CU, Medical Center, on Anschutz. So if there's any organizations within this community that would want to apply for some grants to help close that skill gap, that's one way that we're looking at doing that. So for the past, I would say 3 years, the Skills for Compete board is looking at legislation and policies to help address the skills gap. Because there's a lot of jobs out there, like you mentioned, but there's not the workforce to do it. So there's a lot of kind of activity going on around the state where they're trying to close the gap. So I'd be happy to work with you on that further.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
So we've had a good mix of rural telehealth, workforce, housing mix, aging study. What other issues do you think we should be working on?
Wait, I can close the room down fast.
No, we're all waiting for you to tell us what else we should be doing, Charles.
Just in time.
Good timing.
And we did a little overview, and we're just in, just asking if there's any issues in particular that you think we should be working on that would be helpful for the corridor.
I got one personal, but I don't know about the corridor.
Well, let's go with a personal one.
Well, you know, I've got a grandson that's 3.5 years old, and I started a 529, And I keep hearing rumblings that, well, you know, Obama brought it up, but also hear a little bit of rumblings about changing the state tax deduction for 529s. Now, I happen to be someone that the state tax deduction doesn't make that much difference, but I think that the real value of the 529s comes in the fact that anything you can do to get people to open them creates an expectation and improves the chances that the child will go to college just by virtue of the fact that you've created the account. So,
Yeah.
while I don't know if the taxes are not the issue for me. It's I think that anything that we do, as we're doing, to you know, to encourage people to set up those accounts is really a good thing. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, and so we had talked a little bit about the college debt stuff, but you raised a good point on the 529. So while that's what he's bringing up is under the federal tax code, but there is a state rule in how we basically set up some eligibility for the 529. One of the reports we saw, excuse me, on the 529 is that as it is designed right now, it seems to be primarily giving a benefit for those at the very high end of the wealth spectrum. And so if it's, and in fact some of the people who have, when you just look at the total report, have benefited most are people who may actually be able to just pay for college completely out of pocket and not really need the benefit of the 529 in quite the same way. And so there has been some discussion about where you set the lines on the 529 to make sure that we're helping people throughout the income spectrum and not just people sort of at the top of the income spectrum. We had also looked at, you know, as part of the overall package on 529s, continuing tuition caps in the state because the rate of increase is just high. Other states have better disclosure for students. So a lot of people don't, a lot of the students aren't getting good information about some of their borrowing terms on the difference between public and private loans. And so there are some other states that do better truth in lending, more like we would do in real estate, where you can see the effect of compounded interest over time, and what looks like an appealing loan on the front end when you just need to borrow money may wind up mortgaging your future for 30 years in a way that gets really hard to pay back. So we were looking at increased disclosures on capping private interest rates on student loans, on capping tuition increases, and there was an attempt, and I don't remember if it was House or Senate, but there was also a look at the 529 to see if we were really setting this up in a way that was useful to the whole income spectrum. But I'm glad you brought that up because that's a very important tool. Like you said, it's partly the tax issue, but for a lot of people, it's getting in the mindset of saving specifically for college and realizing that it's one of the few alternatives we have to very serious debt. So your grandson's lucky that you're willing to support.
Even from my side, I mean, I know a lot of people, I was reading statistics that indicate a high percentage of people didn't make even a contribution, have the account, but hadn't made a contribution in years. But again, I think a lot of the value of it is the fact that whatever you put in, whoever puts that in, whether it's a grandparent or parent, I think that just by virtue of setting that up, you gain that expectation you create has a huge value.
Yeah.
I don't know how you ever measure that, but I do know that statistically kids that have any kind of account a higher percentage of them go to college. But that may be also a function of the fact that if you can afford to set the account up, you know, you may be helping to put the kid through college anyway. But
yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, for a lot of folks when we were looking at the numbers, you know, what they're bringing in, I mean, there's some folks that are just in a place where they just don't have enough extra money to be putting away in 529s. And then, if you can, what do you do with it? A couple of you might have been at the town hall we had recently in Aurora, and it was geared largely towards retirement planning and security. But the takeaway that I would share from that here is we had some private financial planners and investors that were part of that meeting. And one of the guys who's a panelist had an interesting idea. I'd be curious to get your thoughts. And he really felt that we should include financial literacy as part of our curriculum in our schools. because the time impact you have both for savings in general, for college savings, and for retirement planning, it's very difficult when you're 55 and starting the process, as opposed to if you're 15 and it's part of your normal everyday education where that maybe the right time to really start working on financial literacy education might be young, very young, so that it gets incorporated. Anyway, that was his thought on that, and I don't know what you guys think about that, but there are a couple other states that, I'm not remembering right now which ones, that have actually incorporated that into their curriculum too.
I thought Rosemary Marshall had worked on that.
She
Was
did.
it the same?
It's the same idea, but what happens is you get a good idea for something that's in curriculum, and then it can come into tension with local control. So people may not want to be told, hey, there's a one-size-fits-all in the curriculum. It probably is helpful to have a standardized curriculum that includes a little bit of education on financial literacy when people are still young enough to really take it in. But I think what Rosemary's became sort of an encouraged, voluntary, and when you pass laws like that,
Nothing
then nothing happens. So I think we have looked at this idea before, but it's definitely not been part of our curriculum. And we've been seeing just the cost, I mean, to the point with your grandson too, the spike, the rate of increase on tuition is alarming, even over the last 5 years and the last 10 years. And so what you might have thought you needed to save for to have in-state tuition, our higher ed has been so underfunded for so long that our in-state rates at our public schools are starting to resemble out-of-state rates and those of private institutions. And so we have really, I mean, I still think community colleges and some of the vocational schools are still offering some affordable choices, but the kind of affordable in-state access to tuition that we used to have in the state has really been stretched. So like either people just aren't going, or they're jumping into a mountain of debt.
If I could just add to that, one of the sort of little-known secrets, I guess, is that we do have concurrent enrollment now with community college while the student is still in high school.